Security expert Chidi Nwaonu of London-based consulting security firm Peccavi is on Zoom to share some insights on these developments. Chidi, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to The Globe.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So is this partnership a continued manifestation of the raging war between the United States and China?
Well, it's a continuation of of the developing situation of the rising power trying to be restrained by the dominant power. So whilst it's on the surface, there's a lot of things to unpack with this deal. Whilst it looks as if it's directed at China, there's other elements that are involved. It also looks to fracture the kind of alliance or the bond between Australia and New Zealand. France, which is, the dominant European military power, particularly the Indo-Pacific, has been put on, on the sidelines by, the submarine deal that it originally had with the Australians being cancelled due to this new deal. But obviously, the main effort is to counter China, and not just counter China directly, but to create a narrative of, a growing pact of nations that are willing to challenge China on its own terms.
So what's the AUKUS alliance and what are its implications?
Well, this is the interesting thing in that what we've heard so far is a discussion about a discussion. So we've been told that, the Australians are going to be purchasing nuclear submarines, I think 8 nuclear submarines, but we've not been told which ones. There could be the British Astute class, there could be the American Virginia class, but whatever it is, it will take another 20 years before they're built, before they're operational. So right now, what we're looking at is a long-term kind of plan, a statement of intent more than anything. But as I said, it's more about bringing together these countries that have maybe decided to draw a line in the sand and say, this is where we're going to start challenging China on its own terms. But it's long enough for there to be play within it, for the Chinese to come back to what, these powers would consider reasonable terms, but also long enough for them to develop those capabilities that they think they need to challenge China in the South China Sea in particular.
And Chidi, you know that this deal actually marks the first time that the United States has shared nuclear technology with an ally apart from the United Kingdom. So what does it mean? Is it an indication perhaps that the United States is on a massive recruitment drive to counter the Chinese influence?
I think it's more indicative of the options that the United States thinks it has running out. And in order to do this, it has to show China that it's willing to, push beyond what it would consider to be the normal accepted red lines. As you said, the technology that the US shares with its allies outside of the UK is quite limited. To share it with Australia, a power on the other side of the world, when you take into account Barack Obama's pivot to Asia, the TTP, and all of these other things, it's again a massive statement of intent. What's going to be very interesting is how China responds to this.
Now, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson, and I'm going to quote, said that the three countries were in the grip of an obsolete Cold War zero-sum mentality and narrow-minded geopolitical concepts and should respect regional people's aspiration. Seeing that the relations between China and these three allies is already low, are we likely to see, a Cold War brewing?
I think the Cold War is already on, so especially with Australia. So Australia is already in the middle of a trade war with China. They're both imposing tariffs on each other. Australian citizens being mistreated in China. There's a lot of issues going on there. So for Australia, this is kind of like a zero-sum kind of reality already. They need to step up and show the Chinese that, they can't be pushed around. And doing that with the backing of America and the backing of Britain also shows the Chinese that this isn't going to be a matter of isolating Australia and then leaving them out. The Cold War has already started, and I think what we're looking at now is that event, pushing it a little bit beyond where it was previously. As I said, how the Chinese respond in terms of whether they decide to proliferate nuclear technology as well, or whether they decide to maybe build a few more islands, is going to be key to how this develops.
Yeah, I suppose then we have to interrogate the reasoning behind, Australia's commitment to nuclear non-proliferation. Why do you think that has been the case? Why do you think Australia took that position?
I think Australia had a very checkered history with nuclear power, obviously with nuclear weapons tests having taken place in Australia and the very strong environmental movements, both in Australia but also in New Zealand. But as I said, I think they've reached a point where they need to do something dramatic in order to prove to the Chinese that they've reached a point of no return. And this is a dramatic break from a long-term kind of strategic outlook that Australia has had. And beyond anything, it demonstrates to the Chinese that the Australians are now serious about pushing back. And they've got, backup from these two established, capable nuclear powers to be able to do this.
And what's interesting then is the role of, of France in these particular developments. And remember that Emmanuel Macron believed that Australian concerns had been sort of assuaged. I mean, despite Canberra repeatedly warning France about the delays and the overruns of this. But it may also be the United States making Australia a deal it could not refuse. But then I get a sense then, Chidi, that the United States does not trust Emmanuel Macron on China. Am I correct?
I think the French have always played a very unique game. In every situation, France has always played its own game without recourse to anyone. So even within NATO, France has kept its own its nuclear weapons out of the NATO chain of command. It conducts unilateral operations all around the world. Even going as far as the last time it operated publicly in the Indo-Pacific, or dramatically, was blowing up a Greenpeace boat. So France has always had that kind of unique maverick role. And I think the big problem for the French is that obviously this is a large defense contract, which they've just lost in terms of these diesel submarines. And they say that they could have provided nuclear submarines if Australia wanted, but they kept them diesel because of Australia's anti-nuclear stance. Now, for France, this is obviously a bit of an embarrassment, a loss of business. It's annoying that they were kept out of the loop. So, again, and more importantly, Macron is in a fairly cheeky presidential election. So whatever reaction you see from France, you have to take that into account, that they have to react aggressively, because Macron can't be seen to be weak, whilst going into this presidential election, and can't be seen to be not fighting France's corner. But how France reacts, how it brings the EU into this again, is another really interesting angle to this story.
Yeah, he's on tricky ground, I must say, because remember that he said that he wanted to steer a middle course between the two great powers, China and the United States. I mean, speaking of an autonomous Europe operating beside America and China, could this be a reality, or it remains a pipe dream?
It's going to be a reality, because whether the world likes it or not, China is a power. It's a rising power. It's the second most wealthy nation on the planet. And I mean, Australia, for all its issues with China, it is still China is still the largest trading partner with Australia. So that middle ground is always going to, it's always going to be the ideal position for everybody, be it Australia, France, the EU, or Britain in of itself. It's just how far do you go between being riding that middle ground and being an independent power, making your own policies, and then and becoming a client state or becoming an adversary. And that's the key kind of sweet spots that everyone's looking for. But Australia has clearly marked its position, and it stepped on that other side and said, I'm happy to be an adversary. France will still try and stay in the middle, play both sides off against the other. And then how this develops, again, as I said, it's a really interesting development.
And what's even more interesting is that, the United States is still fresh from a Trump presidency, and which has shown America's partners and allies alike that, multilateral initiatives can actually unravel overnight with a changing of the guard in Washington. And it begs the question, Chidi, whether this AUKUS initiative will succeed in the end or not.
So there's again, it's a great question. And where it's interesting is that Trump was very America first, and there was no varnish on it. It was American unilateralism, and that's it. Everything else was by the by. And Biden has shown himself in many ways to be of the same kind of cut of the same cloth, but just maybe with a different set of packaging. So the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and now this deal, puts sidelining the French, sidelining the EU. It shows that he's quite happy to do the whole America first thing, but maybe with a little bit of a softer touch. Whether this will be put to one side with the new U.S. administration, it's unlikely, because Australia is an old ally, it's a reliable ally, it's what you would call an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Indo-Pacific. So, I mean, it would take a very brave future U.S. administration to put this deal to one side, and also to be seen to look weak on China. But what's also crucial is that the American political elite is kind of confidently pushing forward with a kind of a unilateralism that you haven't seen, excluding the Trump years, that we haven't seen previously. And it's quite, it's going to be quite interesting to see how that reorders the world in the next, 3-4 years.
All right, Chidi, lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, that was Chidi Nwaonu of London-based consultancy security firm Peccavi joining us via Zoom, just sharing with us his thought with regards to the formation of an alliance between the United States and the United Kingdom and as well as Australia.